presidency, JFK's presidency. I know he was one of the most popular presidents, Democrat. Um, don't really know too much about. Oh, I know he started the Peace Corps, and he's the one who got us started on the race to the moon.
JFK's presidency, what I remember being talked about was that he was so young, attractive, and there was so much hope. Um, and when he was president, he had a young wife, he had small children, and there was so much excitement.
There was a lot of excitement about the fact that he was going to change things.
Looking back on it, that it was a harder road for him than anything because he was the first Roman Catholic president. Um, uh, and I remember learning about the Bay of Pigs and the rise of Fidel Castro taking over Batista down in Cuba, and that there would be moves against communism and going after Castro. And the Bay of Pigs failed miserably. But the thing that I remember most from that was that JFK would have one of his first meetings with Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Russian premier at the time, and which then led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where JFK, I think it was the thought that JFK could get pushed around, or the U.S. could be pushed around, and JFK kind of, they're standing up to the blockade and the Russians bringing ships into the Cuban waters. And I think that was, the tense days of those 13 days in October, I think was really kind of the turning point, because that's really what I remember.
How about the civil rights movement?
Oh, that was a good one. That you have Martin Luther King, who was not a saint. He was a regular human being with lots of fallibilities, who decided to rise above and get people motivated. There were lots of similarities actually between Martin Luther King and JFK.
Like what?
Well, one was white and one was black.
That's not similar.
Both were men.
They were.
They were both men. They were both around the same age. They were both married. They both had idealistic ideals that they were following that in some ways a lot of Americans weren't ready for yet. They both had charisma, and they both gave people hope.
The civil rights movement, what I do remember, because growing up in Harlem, I kind of vaguely remember Malcolm X, because he was very much around the neighborhood that I grew up in. I think it was the idea that Malcolm X would stand up to people that my dad admired. And I remember that because that was always something that he always told us as we got older, was to stand up and learn to fight for your rights, or learn to say something and don't just sit there and take what anybody else is going to tell you. And that's how I always remember the civil rights movement.
Succeeded Kennedy after Kennedy's assassination.
I don't remember him standing out at all. It was almost like people just wanted him to be out of office because he reminded everyone of the assassination.
Lyndon Johnson, but cared greatly for the Great Society, as they always said, and that he wanted to do a lot with social programs and helping out with the Voting Rights Act and things like that. And I kind of remember when he announced that he would not run for president in 1968 because the Vietnam War had grown so much. Growing up, we weren't allowed to watch the news. We weren't allowed to sit and watch it. And in hindsight, I learned later on that the reason that we weren't allowed to watch it is because we discovered that they were showing clips of some of the things going on over in Southeast Asia that were now being shown on television, which was kind of unheard of. I do remember hearing things about evading the draft, because back then you could get drafted and serve in the military. And that was always a big fear, because you were always told that people would run to Canada or other places to avoid um, persecution or deserting rather than serving in the military.
People you knew were given numbers, and if their number was called, they were sent off to war. And they were kids. They were. I know someone who was 17 who went, and you always come back different if you come back. And it was a war that nobody could figure out why exactly we were fighting it. All right, somebody probably figured that out. I didn't figure it out.
And I know it was a conflict that basically never ended. It's one of those situations where there were no winners and no losers. It was basically a draw, and we pulled out as far as I know, and a lot of good people were hurt from that one.
A lot of the older people were kind of disgusted at the students for saying, oh, you know, we shouldn't be in this war. And I think the protests changed the way people saw the process of war. They showed the post-traumatic stress disorder, basically. They showed what people came back like after being involved in and basically killing other people. And it brought a lot of things to light that were not talked about in that time, and were also not acknowledged by the higher ups. That, you know, Agent Orange and all these actually, I think in World War I or World War II it was called you were shell shocked, and what that means now is post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's the same thing. It's always been around after every war. It's just that now that people are looking for treatment for it and opening up about it, and looking for help instead of suffering.
What do you remember about Richard Nixon?
Richard Nixon. Definite politician. Very savvy.
Of Nixon, when he became president in '68. But by that point, it was like so many different things that happened that I can't say that he won by default, but there weren't a lot of challenges to him, in the sense that Robert F. Kennedy had been assassinated, Martin Luther King had been assassinated. There was all kinds of political unrest. Vietnam was still very much on the mind of everybody, and it was just a chaotic time.
Yeah, and that whole peace thing. He was just he was mostly facade. You didn't really see a person there.
There was one show, and it was on NBC, and it was called Julia. And I remember Julia because Diane Carroll, who was like the most beautiful black woman I'd ever seen on television. And she was the first kind of prime time black actress to star in her own show. When I got older, I didn't really know the difference. I just saw this woman and I had a crush on her. I thought she was great looking. And to find out later that this was the first show of its kind to kind of break a barrier it was something that I always remember about a lot of the different shows during the 60s.
Okay, well, if you want to go with like music, it was just all kinds of crazy. Rock and roll was coming out. A lot of psychedelic music was coming out. The hippie movement was very big. There was a lot of drug usage, LSD, marijuana, and the whole 9 yards there. It really kind of took over the culture. Woodstock was a big portion of the music scene back then. Oh, toys. Yeah, lots of good stuff. The Mattel company back then, you always had Hot Wheels and Barbies. Classic was Rock'em Sock'em Robots, Twister. A lot of board games. Believe it or not, it was an age before video games. There were no electronic games.
Living is easy with eyes closed. Misunderstanding all you see.
It was a lot more of creativity on the part of the player, and a lot more stuff was done outside.
Elvis, who was very disturbing to a lot of people because of his dance moves, which these days would just get laughed at, but back then it was incredibly incredible.
Scandalous.
Scandalous, good word. Yeah, it was very scandalous. And the kids loved it. The teens loved it. The parents were very fearful of what was coming, you know.
Well, you ain't never gonna ever and you ain't no friend of mine. Well, they said you was high class. Well, that was just fine. Yeah, you ain't never gonna ever and you ain't no friend of mine. You ain't nothing but a dog.
Martin Luther King Jr., same thing, just disbelief that a man who was trying so hard to change the world for the better in a non-violent way was shot because he was disrupting the apple cart, basically.
It's the night that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And I remember it was April and it was kind of daylight saving, so it was still light out. And I remember we were in our apartment and the news came on and the announcement came out that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. I remember seeing his picture on the back behind the anchorman who was telling the story. And then my mother got up and she quickly turned the TV off. She turned the TV off. She tucked us in and we went to bed early that night. And I always remember it because it was still light out when we went to bed. And the last thing that she told us as she kissed us, she said, "Whatever you hear outside, do not go near the windows." And she left our room and closed the door. Shortly after that, I can remember hearing people screaming and carrying on in the streets about, crying out and screaming and talking about needing to do something. That was probably the most vivid memory of something being so young that I didn't really understand it, but at the same time, I knew that this was a major event.
I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
NASA program and the moon landing. And
The first moon landing. I think that's... I remember that. I remember my father saying he was at a wedding and nobody wanted to watch the wedding. They wanted to watch the actual landing. So they were spending the time between the two. And my grandmother never believed that we really made it to the moon. She said that it was faked and that no man could ever be on the moon.
That was unbelievable. I actually do remember the moon landing. of a friend of mine, actually a friend of my brother's, called me over and said, you know, you have to come in here. They're about to land on the moon. I remember seeing them come out and just touching down on the moon. It was awesome. Just thinking that you look up in the sky and it was, you know, that many thousands of miles away, and there were people there. It was a very interesting time for this country, I think, due to the fact that unbelievable accomplishments were made in science. When you think that when JFK announced, hey, within 10 years we're going to go to the moon, and back then, I mean, there were no systems to get anybody there. There were no, what we think of as computers, or what they thought of as computers back then, are many of the little things that fit on your wrist right now. It's amazing what was accomplished. And the fact that, I mean, the fuel, they didn't have any fuels to get there. They had no ideas on what to do. They had to make it up as they went along. There were some unbelievable accomplishments in the process with the Apollo missions, the Mercury missions, and there were also some tremendous tragedies with astronauts getting killed. But those like real heroes, in my opinion, because without their efforts and their sacrifice, you know, we wouldn't be as far along as we are right now. And I can't wait to see what's going to happen tomorrow, because it's just unbelievable.